On the 7th day of June in 1944, a German soldier named Klaus Müller held the rank of Obergefreiter in the 709th Infantry Division and found himself positioned in the countryside surrounding Sainte-Mère-Église in the Normandy region of France. What he witnessed that morning fundamentally altered his understanding of the conflict in which he was engaged. Standing at his observation post, Müller counted military vehicles rolling past his position in an unending stream from the beaches the Americans had designated as Utah. During a period of approximately 120 minutes, he documented the passage of 117 reconnaissance vehicles, each appearing freshly manufactured and identical to the last. The implications of what he observed went far beyond the tactical situation of the moment. These machines, which the American forces referred to as jeeps, represented something Müller and his fellow soldiers had never encountered in their military experience. They had not simply been transported across the English Channel, but had made the journey across the entire Atlantic Ocean, and their quantities suggested a level of industrial production that contradicted everything the German military establishment understood about the limitations of war production. What became clear to Müller and would soon become evident to every German soldier in Normandy was that they were not confronting merely another army, but rather an entire industrial civilization that had reorganized itself for the production of military equipment on a scale that transformed the very nature of armed conflict. The vehicles began appearing on French soil with the initial assault waves, their drivers steering them directly from the landing craft known as LSTS, which had furched them across the Channel waters in convoys so numerous that observers lost count. A single landing ship of this type possessed the capacity to transport 30 of these vehicles in fully assembled condition, and the number of such ships delivering their contents to the Norman coastline numbered in the hundreds. Every vehicle carried identification marking it as a product of either the Willys Overland Motor Company, whose facilities were located in Toledo within the state of Ohio, or the Ford Motor Company, operating from Dearborn in Michigan. Their official military designation identified them as truck, quarter-ton, 4x4 command reconnaissance, but to the German troops who watched them arrive in seemingly inexhaustible numbers, they signified something far more troubling than their technical specifications would suggest. They were tangible evidence of an industrial capability that exceeded anything in German experience or planning. Werner Lindemann, who commanded the 3rd Company of the 919th Grenadier Regiment with the rank of Hauptmann, documented his observations in an official report submitted on the 9th of June in that year. His words conveyed the shock of recognition that was spreading through German ranks. The enemy deployed vehicles in such abundance that the comparison to ammunition expenditure seemed appropriate. American military organization provided motorized transportation to units at every level of their structure, extending down to the smallest tactical formations. His company had succeeded in destroying 12 of the American reconnaissance vehicles on the previous day, yet when morning arrived, he counted 40 such vehicles operating in the identical sector. The Americans treated these complex machines with the same casual attitude German forces reserved for rifle cartridges, using them freely and abandoning them without apparent concern for the loss. Had German military planners possessed knowledge of the actual production statistics, their astonishment would have been even more profound. During the years spanning 1941 through 1945, American manufacturing facilities produced a total exceeding 640,000 of these jeeps. At the peak of their production capacity, the Willys Overland and Ford factories were completing individual vehicles at intervals of 90 seconds. This single vehicle type accounted for 1/4 of the total American military motor transport production during the entire war. Germany, by comparison, had managed to manufacture approximately 50,000 Kübelwagens throughout the entire duration of the conflict, and German military minds found the American numbers incomprehensible when they learned them. The foundation of this production miracle rested upon standardization principles that went beyond anything the German military had implemented. Every Jeep, regardless of whether Willys or Ford had manufactured it, utilized components that were entirely interchangeable with those from the other manufacturer. A transmission removed from a destroyed Ford GPW could be installed in a Willys MB within minutes, and mechanics could complete the exchange without modification or adaptation. Wheels, engines, axles, and even minor components such as spark plugs and fan belts maintained identical specifications across all production runs and all manufacturing facilities. This standardization philosophy extended throughout the entire supply system, where spare parts were pre-positioned at supply points based on statistical calculations of component failure rates, ensuring that replacement parts were always available when and where they were needed. Hans Richter served as a Feldwebel in the 716th Static Infantry Division and spent considerable time observing American operations from a position of concealment near Carentan. His personal diary entries revealed the cognitive dissonance German soldiers experienced when confronting American maintenance practices. The Americans did not repair their vehicles in the traditional sense. Instead, they simply replaced failed components with new ones drawn from what appeared to be an unlimited inventory. He personally witnessed a damaged vehicle returned to operational status in less than 60 minutes. The engine had not been repaired through careful diagnosis and correction of the fault, but rather had been completely removed and replaced with an entirely new engine. The process involved unbolting the damaged engine, lifting it from the vehicle, and installing a fresh engine with the same casual efficiency one might employ when changing a tyre. German mechanics would require a full week to perform such an operation under ideal conditions. The Americans accomplished it in a field environment, under sporadic artillery bombardment, while the mechanics smoked cigarettes and conversed casually. The German military tradition, which emphasized the preservation and careful maintenance of every piece of equipment, found the American approach fundamentally incomprehensible. Within the Wehrmacht organizational structure, vehicles were assigned to specific units and their service lives were carefully tracked and documented. Losing a vehicle through negligence constituted an offense serious enough to warrant court-martial proceedings. When mechanical problems arose, they were diagnosed with precision and care. Parts were repaired whenever possible, or manufactured in unit workshops when replacement parts could not be obtained through normal supply channels. The Kübelwagen, which represented Germany's closest equivalent to the American Jeep, required mechanics with factory-level training for any maintenance work beyond the most basic procedures. American forces operated according to entirely different principles. Their planners had calculated that the average combat life expectancy of a Jeep in frontline service was 90 days, and they had organized their production and supply systems accordingly. Rather than investing resources in elaborate repair facilities and extended maintenance procedures, they simply manufactured replacement vehicles in quantities that exceeded any conceivable loss rate. When a Jeep sustained damage beyond what could be repaired with immediate field maintenance, it was stripped of any usable components and then abandoned. A replacement vehicle would arrive within hours, or, at most, a few days, delivered by the continuous convoy system that connected the beach landing areas to the advancing frontline positions. Otto von Schröder held the position of Chief of Staff for the 352nd Infantry Division with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, and he captured the German sense of bewilderment in correspondence with his wife. The Americans, he wrote, conducted what he termed a rich man's war. They expended vehicles with the same casual attitude German forces applied to ammunition consumption. On the previous day, he had personally observed a Jeep strike an anti-tank mine. The crew emerged from the vehicle without serious injury, transferred their equipment and weapons to another Jeep that materialized within minutes, and continued their assigned mission without interruption. The destroyed Jeep was pushed to the roadside and forgotten. Within German military practice, such a loss would trigger mandatory reports, formal investigations, and weeks of bureaucratic effort to obtain authorization for a replacement vehicle. The contrast could not have been more stark. By the 10th of June, American forces had successfully landed more than 12,000 vehicles in the Normandy beachhead, with Jeeps comprising the single largest category within that total. These vehicles transformed the character of battlefield operations in ways that German doctrine had not anticipated and could not counter. American reconnaissance formations penetrated German defensive lines with unprecedented speed and agility. Artillery forward observers operating from jeeps could relocate rapidly and continuously, rendering German counter-battery fire almost impossible to execute effectively. Supply units maintained uninterrupted contact with advancing combat formations, eliminating the operational pauses for consolidation and resupply that German commanders had expected to exploit for counterattacks. The jeep's inherent capabilities multiplied German tactical difficulties. Its four-wheel drive system, combined with its relatively low weight, allowed it to traverse terrain that German planning had categorized as impassable for vehicles. The Norman Bocage country, characterized by sunken roads and dense hedgerows, should have channeled American vehicles into predictable routes that German forces had prepared to defend with concentrated firepower. Instead, jeeps simply drove through agricultural fields, over embankments, and around obstacles. They created their own transportation network, independent of the mapped road system that German forces had prepared to defend. The fundamental assumptions of German defensive planning were rendered obsolete. Hans von Luck commanded a battle group from the 21st Panzer Division with the rank of Oberst, and in his post-war writings he reflected on the impact of American motorization. The jeep provided every American unit with the mobility that German forces had achieved only with their elite mechanized formations. A single vehicle could transport a machine gun team, a mortar crew, communications equipment, or supplies with equal facility. These vehicles appeared everywhere, including in locations German commanders had considered secure from enemy penetration. They brought firepower to unexpected positions or called in artillery strikes using their radio equipment. German forces could not establish a continuous defensive front because American units simply drove around established positions, exploiting gaps and creating new ones. The maintenance and supply infrastructure supporting these vehicles proved equally overwhelming to German observers. American logistics units had prepared for operations conducted on an industrial scale. Ships arrived daily, carrying not merely fuel and ammunition, but entire replacement vehicles, spare engines, transmissions, and prepackaged component sets designed for rapid installation. Mobile maintenance workshops advanced immediately behind combat units, possessing the capability to perform any repair or replacement operation. When a unit lost 10 jeeps in combat operations, 10 replacement vehicles would arrive within 48 hours, and frequently in less time. Heinrich Zimmermann served as a major with the 12th SS Panzer Division and documented his observations of American logistics. The American supply system, he noted, operated like a factory production line that had been extended directly to the battlefield environment. Everything was standardized, packaged according to uniform specifications, and delivered on predetermined schedules. They had succeeded in removing from warfare the friction that Clausewitz had described as inherent to military operations. While German units struggled constantly to maintain their existing equipment in operational condition, American forces simply ordered replacements as though selecting items from a commercial catalogue. The psychological impact on German forces manifested within days of the invasion commencement. Soldiers who had been indoctrinated with the belief that Americans were soft and excessively dependent on material comfort discovered instead an enemy who possessed material abundance beyond anything they had imagined possible. The sight of endless columns of identical jeeps, each one appearing new and fully equipped, demoralized troops who were carefully preserving vehicles that had been in continuous service since the Polish campaign of 1939. The contrast between German scarcity and American abundance became impossible to ignore or rationalize. Wolfgang Braun worked as a mechanic with the 21st Panzer Division, holding the rank of Gefreiter, and he examined captured jeeps with professional interest. His technical assessment revealed much about the philosophical differences between German and American approaches to military production. Every component, he reported, was designed specifically for mass production and ease of replacement. The engine design was simple rather than sophisticated, yet entirely adequate for its intended purpose. The transmission was robust rather than refined in its engineering. Nothing about the vehicle was polished or precisely fitted in the manner German engineers would have insisted upon, yet everything functioned with reliable consistency. The Americans had deliberately sacrificed elegance for quantity, and the strategy of quantity was proving victorious in actual combat. The racial integration visible in American motor pools particularly troubled German observers who had been indoctrinated in the racial ideology promoted by the regime. African-American soldiers drove jeeps, performed maintenance on them, and supervised motor pools with evident competence. This observable reality challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and military effectiveness that formed part of official doctrine. Kurt Wagner, a Feldwebel, noted with evident bewilderment that Negro soldiers operated and repaired these vehicles with the same efficiency as white soldiers. The racial theories they had been taught suggested this should be impossible, yet the evidence before their eyes was undeniable and could not be reconciled with their ideological instruction. American modifications to their jeeps demonstrated a flexibility and adaptability that German military culture, with its emphasis on following established procedures, could not easily accommodate. Within days of landing in France, American units were welding additional armor plate onto their vehicles, installing wire cutters to counter German piano wire traps strung across roads, mounting multiple machine guns for increased firepower, and adapting vehicles for specialized roles that had not been anticipated in their original design. Medical units converted jeeps to ambulances by installing stretcher racks. Signal units loaded them with radio equipment beyond standard configuration. Engineer units mounted mine detectors. Each modification was crude and improvised by German standards, yet immediately effective in addressing tactical problems as they arose. The contrast with German equipment became increasingly stark as the campaign progressed through June and into July. Wehrmacht vehicles required specific fuel grades that were not always available, specialized spare parts that had to be obtained through complex supply channels, and trained mechanics who understood their particular systems. Many German divisions still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport, with a single division requiring thousands of horses that consumed tons of fodder daily. The horses were vulnerable to artillery fire, required constant care and attention, and limited the mobility of their units to walking pace. Watching American units advance at 30 miles per hour in vehicles that required only gasoline and basic maintenance knowledge created a profound sense of demoralization among German troops. By the 15th of June, German intelligence services estimated that American forces in the Normandy beachhead possessed over 4,000 jeeps, with hundreds more arriving with each passing day. This number seemed impossible to officers who could remember the entire German army invading Poland with fewer than 3,000 motor vehicles of all types combined. The mathematics of American production suggested that the United States could lose every single vehicle currently in Normandy and replace the entire inventory within a 2-week period. This calculation, when understood, had devastating implications for German hopes of defeating the invasion. Ernst Wagner served as a colonel with the Panzer Lehr Division and compiled a comprehensive report that reached Field Marshal Rommel shortly before his injury in a strafing attack. The report stated clearly that German forces faced an enemy who had industrialized warfare to a degree they had never imagined possible. The Americans mass-produced military vehicles using the same assembly line methods they employed for civilian automobile production. Every American soldier appeared to possess basic driving skills and could perform routine maintenance. Their entire society had been mobilized for mechanical warfare in ways German society had never achieved, even at the peak of total war mobilization. The disparity in production philosophy proved impossible to bridge through any tactical or operational measures. German vehicles like the Kübelwagen were well-engineered products, carefully constructed and designed for longevity and sustained service. However, Germany could produce only a few dozen of these vehicles per day, even at peak production rates. American jeeps were simple in design and crude by German engineering standards, yet they emerged from assembly lines at rates that exceeded Germany's combined output from all its factories. Where German industry pursued perfection in individual vehicles, American industry pursued adequacy multiplied by overwhelming numerical superiority. The strategic implications were inescapable. Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzer Lehr Division with the rank of General Major and provided a stark assessment that captured the fundamental mismatch. German forces were fighting the previous war while the Americans were fighting the next one. Germany perfected individual vehicles while America perfected the industrial system that produced vehicles. Germany trained specialist mechanics while America designed vehicles that any soldier could maintain with basic instruction. German forces represented artisans fighting against an assembly line, and the assembly line was proving victorious on the battlefield. The redundancy built into the American system frustrated every German tactical plan. Destroying a bridge to halt American supply columns proved futile when engineer units appeared within hours carrying portable bridging equipment transported on jeeps. Ambushing reconnaissance patrols achieved minimal results when identical replacement vehicles and crews appeared immediately to continue the mission. Every German tactical success was negated by American material abundance. The traditional calculus of warfare, based on attrition and the destruction of enemy resources, simply did not apply when the enemy could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. The Jeep transcended its purely military function to become a symbol of abundance that German soldiers found both amazing and profoundly demoralizing. Reports from the front described Jeeps being used for tasks that would have been unthinkable within Wehrmacht practice. They delivered mail to frontline positions, transported journalists covering the campaign, carried chaplains forward to conduct religious services, and even moved generals' personal baggage. This casual use of military equipment for convenience rather than strict operational necessity demonstrated a wealth of resources that German soldiers, accustomed to constant scarcity and the careful preservation of every item, found incomprehensible. Friedrich Hoffmann, a lieutenant, wrote to his family describing the cultural shock of confronting American logistics. The Americans used their vehicles with the same casual attitude German soldiers applied to bicycles, employing them for every purpose without concern for mechanical wear. He had personally observed a jeep being used to deliver hot food to a single isolated outpost, a journey that consumed fuel and added wear to the engine for the sole purpose of providing comfort to 3 men. Within German military practice, those men would have walked to collect their rations and would have eaten them cold. This apparent wastefulness should have represented a weakness and inefficiency, but when one could waste resources without consequence due to unlimited availability, it transformed into a form of strength. The technological gap manifested in unexpected ways beyond the vehicles themselves. American Jeeps came equipped with standardized toolkits, comprehensive maintenance manuals printed on waterproof paper that could withstand field conditions, and spare parts packages calculated through statistical analysis to provide the items most likely to fail. German vehicles often lacked basic tools, relied on the accumulated experience of mechanics rather than written documentation, and competed for scarce spare parts through a complex requisition system that could require weeks to produce results. As June transitioned into July, German forces found themselves increasingly unable to compete with American mobility. Static defensive positions were outflanked by jeep-mounted reconnaissance units that identified weak points and gaps. Artillery positions were overrun by rapidly advancing motorized infantry that struck before guns could be withdrawn. Supply lines were severed by fast-moving patrols that appeared behind German lines, struck their targets, and disappeared before reserves could respond to the threat. The battlefield had become fluid in ways that inherently favored the side with unlimited motorization. Wilhelm von Stülpnagel observed American breakout preparations in late July with the rank of major and documented his conclusions. The Americans had achieved something German military theorists had considered impossible within practical constraints. They had accomplished the complete motorization of an entire field army. Every soldier could be transported by vehicle. Every artillery piece could be towed at highway speeds. Every supply item could be delivered directly to the consuming unit without intermediate handling. German forces were fighting a 19th-century war of limited mobility against a 20th-century enemy who had transcended traditional limitations. The German High Command's attempts to counter American motorization proved completely futile. Orders to target vehicle concentrations were meaningless when vehicles were distributed everywhere throughout the American rear areas. Efforts to interdict supply lines failed when every unit possessed organic transportation sufficient for its needs. Plans to exploit American dependence on fuel supplies were negated by a logistics system that delivered gasoline in quantities Germany had not seen since the spring of 1940, when captured French stocks were still available. By the time Operation Cobra commenced in late July, American forces in Normandy possessed over 15,000 vehicles of all types, with Jeep still comprising the single largest category within that total. German intelligence estimates, compiled from prisoner interrogations and aerial reconnaissance photographs, suggested that American forces could sustain 50% vehicle losses and still remain more thoroughly motorized than any German division at full authorized strength. This calculation, when reported to Berlin through command channels, was dismissed as defeatist and was actually conservative in its estimates. The influence of American motorization extended beyond its immediate military impact on the Normandy campaign. German officers who survived the war and lived to witness the Reconstruction period would carry these lessons into the development of post-war Germany. The American model of standardization, mass production emphasis, and design simplicity would directly influence German industrial development in subsequent decades. The Volkswagen, which had failed as the Kübelwagen to compete with the Jeep in wartime, would succeed as the Beetle in peacetime by applying the mass production principles that Americans had demonstrated so devastatingly on the battlefield. Otto Schultz spent 3 years as a prisoner of war in America following his capture and later reflected on the lessons learned in Normandy. During those years in captivity, he witnessed American industrial capacity first-hand in civilian contexts. In Normandy, he had learned that modern warfare was not fundamentally about courage or tactical skill, but about industrial capacity and organizational efficiency. The Americans had demonstrated that victory belonged to whichever side could produce the most equipment, ship it the fastest, and replace combat losses immediately. The Jeep was not merely a vehicle in the narrow technical sense, but rather a symbol of a new form of warfare that German forces had not been prepared to fight and could not match. The story of German troops encountering American mass motorization in Normandy represents more than a simple military mismatch or tactical disadvantage. It was a collision between two fundamentally different civilizations and their approaches to warfare. The Germans, with their long tradition of professional military excellence, careful craftsmanship, and meticulously maintained equipment, encountered an American military that had transformed warfare into an exercise in industrial management and mass production principles borrowed from civilian manufacturing. Every Jeep that rolled off the landing ships and onto French soil carried a message to the German defenders. These vehicles represented the arsenal of democracy in physical form, tangible proof that American industrial power could be projected across oceans and delivered to battlefields in quantities that rendered traditional military calculations completely obsolete. For German soldiers watching those columns advance day after day in seemingly endless numbers, each Jeep served as a messenger bearing the same simple but devastating truth. The age of artisan warfare, based on skilled craftsmanship and careful resource management, had definitively ended. The age of industrial warfare, based on mass production and material abundance, had begun, and Germany was on the wrong side of that transition. The final assessment belongs to Ernst Bergmann, who held the rank of Hauptmann and observed American operations throughout the Normandy campaign before surviving to become an automotive engineer in post-war Germany. The Americans, he later reflected, taught German forces a fundamental lesson about the nature of modern warfare. In contemporary conflict, the factory is more important than the battlefield itself. Their jeeps, arriving in endless identical numbers with each one completely replaceable, demonstrated conclusively that warfare had transformed into a branch of industry. German soldiers thought of themselves as warriors in the traditional sense. The Americans showed them that they were simply workers in a factory of destruction, and the American factory of destruction was infinitely larger, more efficient, and more productive than anything Germany could create or sustain. That lesson, learned at tremendous cost in Normandy, would reshape German thinking about military affairs for generations to come.